it's time to start building the new workshop. So first job was to get everything cleared out. Thankfully I'd put a lot of things on pallets, so things were easy to move around. A couple of things were quite heavy, so brought the tractor in and got those pulled out. Here's the back left of the barn, which, if you remember back to the first video, was the bit that's completely full of water. Thankfully things have dried out a bit now. And here's the back right, where at the end of the last video everything was sort of roughly set up, and I've just pulled all the machines out ready to build. The building materials had to come in across one of the local fields, as there isn't enough room down the drive to get a lorry with things on down to the house, and I could just unload the trailer with the tractor again. So here we are setting out the first course of block work. I'm just using a laser level to check the heights, and this is going to be the front wall of the workshop, which is actually going to be a cavity wall, so there will be insulation. This is the first course going down. I'm soaking the blocks in some water because they're aircrete blocks, which is concrete filled with air. Makes them a little bit lighter, but it means that they suck the moisture out of the mortar mix, which I'm doing a great job of applying to the end of the block. It's my first go at block work. Thankfully by the 1000th block I did get a little bit better. I'm using a string line to get everything lined up, and while I'm still haven't got a clue what I'm doing, I'm knocking them into place with a mallet. First couple of courses going in here. The end that you can see next to the red toolboxes is going to be a big doorway, and then the contents of the workshop are just piled up in a heap outside. So this is the front wall meeting the outside wall, and you'll notice there's a cavity going through, and this little eye is going to have a string tied into it, and that will hold the insulation off of the outside wall and stop any damp getting to the back of the insulation. Alright. There's also a damp-proof membrane running down the wall to stop any water coming in and getting into that blockwork. On the back wall and side walls I also drilled and put in eyes to correspond with the front wall, so that the string had something to attach to at the other end. It's just a wall plug and screw straight in. Here's the back right corner, and you can see that the eyes go up every other course. On the other side of the workshop, after I'd done this, I actually decided to run them every course, and that worked a little bit better. So the string just gets tied to the eyelet on the front wall, run along, and then tied to the eyelet at the back. Part way along there are some piers to stiffen the wall, and the bit of string just gets trapped in the pier just to give it some intermediate support part way along the wall. And here's the insulation going in. First couple of courses of block work is up now, and you can just make out one of the piers behind my right leg. And then this is the front wall. On the front obviously it doesn't need the bit of string because the insulation just gets trapped between the two layers of block work, and there shouldn't be any rain hitting it so it won't get wet. And at the moment it's just being supported by the wall ties. You can just see them poking out through the gaps between the insulation. And then this is the bit by the side of where the main door is going to be. So there's a big column there which is going to support some steel beams later on. So here we are. This is the back and the right hand side. So what I'm doing is I'm building one side of the workshop first to solve all the problems, and then I'm going to build the mirror image of it over the centre line, and then sort of put a roof over it and make a mezzanine. And this is a view down the back wall, and you can see that piece of string. It's actually electric fence wire holding the insulation away from the outside wall. And we're almost up now, so sort of wall's 3/4 of the way up. My blockwork's getting a little bit better at this point. To make sure all the blockwork was on bond, I just made a tower in the middle of the room and used some bits of wood to replicate the mortar joint, and the laser level just went up one course at a time. So here's the first half of the workshop. Walls up, and they're just about ready to put the steel beams up. You can see in a few places there are some dense concrete blocks, and they're the areas where the steel beams are going to go. But for one of the beams I needed to make a concrete pad to just set the heights, so I made a mould out of some offcuts of timber, put the mould on top of the column. You can see the column in the blockwork there, filled it with a concrete mix and got it smoothed out and levelled off, checked everything with the laser and got everything to the right height. Let that dry, took the former off, and then I could bring the tractor in, very carefully bring it in, try not to knock the walls over. And with the tractor in place, we could back the trailer in with the steels on, and then get those strapped onto the bottom of the bucket of the tractor and lifted off. And then the trailer could just be taken out from underneath. Part of the design of the workshop very much is dictated by the tools I had available. This beam's 450-ish kilos, and that's as high as I can lift it with the tractor. So that's the height of the ceiling, which works out at a ceiling height of 2.5 meters almost exactly, which is just a bit over 8 feet. So normal sort of domestic ceiling height. It would have been nice for it to be in a little bit higher, but on the flip side, having it that height also means I've got a decent amount of headroom on the mezzanine above. So my blockwork's getting a little bit better. There's a few sort of odd blocks that had to be cut to fit the beams in, and they just go in like that. A little bit of rubbing up of the joints, make sure everything's nicely filled, and this is the first half of the blockwork done. So that's a 14-inch steel running across the top there, and then there's a couple more steels to go in at 90 degrees to that, and they're just coming in here now on top of the little welding table that I built. That's worked really well for moving some of the heavy things around. It's a nice strong table. I just had to cope the ends so that I could weld them together. I'm just going to weld them in situ. I'm not going to bother plating and bolting. I have no intention of ever taking it to bits, and since it's all being built on site, it makes sense to just weld it all in situ. To lift these up, I chucked a block and tackle over one of the roof purlins and then just hoisted them up very carefully. I was a bit dubious on the first one, and then I've had a few of these to do. By the time I'd done the first one, I was pretty confident in the technique, and they just lift in, and then I got the MIG welder out and glued them in place. You can see I've just got a block with some clamps on the top, which is keeping the top flush and in position. I actually did 2 passes with the MIG, did a V-prep on the end of the beam, did a root pass, and then a top pass over that to make sure it was a good hot strong joint, and that's worked really well. I could then start cutting some floor joists. These are 7x2, and I just put a small end detail in so that I could have the bottom of the joist sat on the inside of the flange, and then the top of the joist flush with the top flange, which means the floorboards can just go straight down onto the top, and they just slip in. Obviously these ones in the middle have got that detail on both ends, and then the ones on the outside that just rest on the wall have only got it on one end. So in between each of the joists I cut some noggins. I just made one as a template, and then I could set the saw up and drop it in and then cut those all to length. These are out of the same 7x2, and then they just go in, a couple of screws in each end, drive those in with the impact driver. Then the plasterboard goes up. I actually bought this little plasterboard hoist from the recommendation of a friend, and oh my goodness, I am glad I did. This would have been a horrendous job without it. It's brilliant. And then taped up the joints. I'm using tapered edge plasterboard, so I've only got to fill the joints. It's only a workshop ceiling, so I'm not being too precious about it. And then just fill those in with a plasterer's trowel, and then sanded it off with dual action sander. Bit of a shoulder buster this. Couple of coats of masonry paint on the inside, nice and white, and then I could put in the first fix for the electrics. Lots of sockets. I'm using plastic conduit, just cuts with a normal plumber's pipe cutter, and then it has these little fittings that go on the end, and they've got a thread in one end, and you just push them on, and then the boxes have knockouts, so you can just put them on, and then there's a special nut that goes on the inside and just screws the whole thing together. Really quick, really easy, plenty good enough for this application. So here's the first side done. We've had some electric connected up to them, and tools moved in just to keep them out of harm's way while we build the other side. Now the other side, we have to deal with this wet problem first. I've got to fix that before winter, because otherwise it's just going to ruin everything. So round the back of the shed with the mini digger, I was hoping I could just get in and dig it all out, 2 days, job done. But we're on bedrock slate here, and if you've ever dug slate, it only digs in one direction. It kind of grows in sheets, and if you can get the teeth of the digger between the sheets, it just peels off. But of course, to get that angle, I would have had to have knocked the back wall of the shed down. So the digger was pretty useless in reality, and I had to do the whole job with a jackhammer and a mattock and a spade, and it took forever, to be honest. It was truly a back-breaking job. But the idea was dig a trench all the way around the outside. So this is the trench along the back wall. You can see the man door in the back of the barn. And then I could clear all the rubble out, and then start cutting out underneath the wall so that I could underpin and basically drop the wall height, or make the bottom of the wall lower than the floor inside, basically. So any water that collects is below the floor, below the damp-proof membrane, and we don't get any ingress. And I just put in some concrete blocks as temporary supports while I dug out underneath. Now, inside, some of the original floor, when it was cast, actually ran underneath the edge of the wall. The walls were built and then the floor was put in afterwards. So I just cut the edge back with the angle grinder, a bit of water kept the dust down. We'll ignore the fact I'm using a mains grinder with a load of water. And then I could just break away the edge with the jackhammer. Very careful not to puncture the damp-proof membrane. I then built some shuttering so that I could pour concrete in. I'm just using some OSB for the shuttering, and then the concrete blocks to create a solid backer so that it doesn't all burst out. And there's a few wooden spacers to just set the gap, and there's a load more on the outside. So mixed up some concrete. This short piece along the back wall, about 4.5 metres, about a cubic metre of concrete went in there, and that took about 3 hours or so to do. The side walls, there's another couple of cubic metres, so this was a good few days work. So here's the side, and again, I could get in a little bit with the digger, but the vast majority had to be dug out by hand. So here's the inside. You can just see the underpinnings, and the first course of blockwork is in. So this is exactly a mirror image of the other side, and thankfully we're getting to the point where my blockwork is a little bit better and quite a lot faster. So the wall's up now, just about ready for the beams to go on. The beams on this side were a bit more tricky because I had to back the tractor underneath the ceiling of the other side, which meant I had to take the roof off. But then once I'd got the tractor in, the beam could come in on the trailer just like before and be lifted off, and then drive the tractor forward and drop it into position. So same routine, just more things to crash into. So here's the finished walls for the left hand side of the workshop. Again, exact mirror image. With those done, I could then start filling in the middle. So here's the back door, so just a basic steel across the back there. I then coped the ends of a couple of steels to join the two halves together. Lifted those in place with the tractor, just slid it onto the top of the bucket, picked it up, and then just sort of bumped it around on my shoulder on top of a ladder to get it in the gap. I sort of had to wiggle it up and down the boom because I couldn't lift it straight up because the flange of the existing beams are are in the way, so I had to put one end on and then slide it back and forwards to get it in the gap, and then I could lift it up and slip a block of wood underneath it, and then do the other end and come back and put a bigger block of wood underneath it to get it up to height. And then you can just see I've got a ratchet strap ready at the back there to pull everything together. You can see the ratchet straps there while I'm preheating the joint, and then got in with the MIG and joined everything up. I was really happy with this because I want those two big beams to be completely parallel, and I managed that to within a millimetre. So if I ever want to run a gantry crane along there, I can. So at the front of the workshop where the big door is going to be, I put a steel across there as well, and just put it on sideways, and then I could just roll it up. It was easier than trying to balance it on top of the bucket this way up. So that's all the steel work up, and then some more floor ceiling or floor joists, depending on which side of them you're stood on. And they just go in the same as all the rest. And a bit of plasterboard to seal it all off. Since it's 170mm ceiling joists, you can actually get 170mm top-up packs for insulation in the UK, so that was a nice convenient size to put in between the joists to make sure they were nice and full of insulation. And then it's 18mm OSB, and I'm cutting them down so that they overlap the joints of the steels to tie each of the three sections of roof together, and that way if there is any sort of movement, nothing sort of comes adrift, if that makes sense. So here's the finished mezzanine. The plan is to just put all of the stuff up here that you need for the workshop but you don't need in the workshop, you know, all the material and things like that. And here's the right hand side of the workshop. Everything's been moved back in. It's just sort of roughly laid out at the moment. I'm sure everything will move over the next few months as jobs come in and out and things get made. And here's the left hand side. You can see I still need to make a door. So at the moment I've just got a few temporary benches set up for one of those batches of valves that I did in a previous video. There's quite a few in this batch, so they're sort of dominating the space. Hope you've enjoyed the video, and see you next time. Thanks for watching.